Hi, everyone. Welcome to Rising Light with Bryan and Melissa. If you've ever felt like your animal is trying to tell you something, you're probably right. I'm Melissa, and I work with my team of angels to help people release old energetic patterns and emotions that no longer serve so that they can reconnect with their authentic self and live a life with more peace, joy, and purpose. I'm also an animal communicator, which is what we're going to be talking about today, what animal communication is, how it works, and our experiences with it.
Thanks, Melissa. And my name is Bryan. I'm somewhat of a researcher on this topic. I've known Melissa now for 7 years, and she and I have talked a lot about animal communication and channeling and telepathy. And I'm currently doing some research on telepathy, which a lot of it was inspired by a podcast called the Telepathy Tapes, which I highly recommend to anyone who hasn't listened to that yet. It's about telepathy and humans and animals, and specifically it really delves into the topic of telepathy and autistic children. Very fascinating topic, and that was kind of the springboard for me to get into this topic that Melissa has a pretty extensive background in. And so for me, this is just interesting because I have some limited experience with communication and telepathy with animals, but I'm kind of curious to hear more about your experiences, Melissa, and how you got into this. If it was something that you just discovered by accident, or if you had gone in intentionally to research and cultivate those abilities.
Yeah, so I've always been an animal person. They've always been drawn to me, and I've always enjoyed being around them. Um, so years ago, I had my own business doing pet sitting and dog training and behavior modification. So I realize now in hindsight, I was communicating with the dogs like during my training sessions, but it was just so natural. I didn't know that I was doing animal communication. And so that was probably like, I started that, geez, probably over 20 years ago. And then more recently, like a decade ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who is a channel, and I was like, I feel like I should be working on something, like kind of like what's next for me. And she said, animal communication. And I was like, oh, that's cool. I'm going to try it. So I uh, texted some friends and I was like, I'm going to try communicating with your pets if that's okay. And yeah, then it just went from there. But that's how I started.
So what was it like with you and trying to communicate with animals in the beginning? Did you feel like it just kind of came naturally right away, or did you have to develop the ability?
It came pretty naturally right away. Like I said, I was already doing it, but sometimes when you just don't get in your head about things and they just flow, that's easier. And then when you're like, oh, I need to do this for real, right? Then your mind can kind of get in the way. So I remember the first time I was like getting images from a dog, and I wasn't, and I was talking to the dog without the person there, so I couldn't ask why am I seeing this? Like why am I seeing a plaid couch? And at that time, and I was the same way with channeling. I forget, or I didn't realize, I guess I didn't forget that you it's like a conversation, right? I could have been like, why are you showing me this plaid couch? But instead I'm like, oh, I don't know what that means, and then I just went to the next thing. So to answer your question, it was a little bit of both, in the sense that I was like, I don't know what any of these symbols mean until I or these images mean until I talked to the dog's
Well,
mom.
it's interesting you mentioned just the fact that you're an animal person, because one of the things that Rupert Sheldrake, who wrote Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, which is one of the books that the telepathy tapes references, about this ability for animals to have a sense of premonition, and also location, like, animals that
Yeah.
are transported, hundreds of miles and then somehow find their way back home. and also telepathy. Just that he said that what seems to determine whether a person has these abilities is their emotional connection to the animal. And this can be both positive and negative because I think the positive emotional connection that you experience and a lot of other people experience, and even between humans and other humans, like mothers and their children, this is really common too. But just that it's that strong emotional bond that seems to help facilitate that communication between humans and animals. And obviously, for an animal, it's to their benefit to have that communication when they sense danger from someone too. So if there's a strong negative emotional connection, that helps them if they're trying to avoid something that might be a threat to their survival. So I'm curious if you've noticed that in maybe in other people too. Do you find that this is something that's common with people that they might not even realize that they're communicating with animals? I know for me, I don't have many pets. My daughter has a cat with her at her mom's house, and we have a gerbil, and the gerbil's escaped a few times, and I was trying to kind of apply what I was learning to see if I could convince it to come back. I thought, if it gets into the HVAC system, it's just gone. We're never going to find it again. And so I was sort of sending these mental signals just to see what would happen. Like, if you come back, I'll let you out every day. And then sure enough, it came back. And that's happened 3 times now. So it could just be happenstance, but I thought it was funny that I'm sitting there trying to communicate with this gerbil while, trying to figure out if I'm ever going to find it and spare my daughter the distress from losing her pet.
Yeah, and that's one thing I don't think a lot of people realize that our pets are reading our thoughts all the time, even if we're not able to read theirs. So, yeah, I was going to ask what you told it or what you like communicated. I was like, oh, did you just show it some food? Like that's usually a
I made a deal with
good
it. I was like, if you
motivator.
come, and like, I know you want to be free and, get out, and I'll let you out every day if you come back. So I've tried to make a point to get it out of it's got kind of a terrarium. It's got a few cages, actually. The one it's in right now is kind of like a terrarium glass enclosure. But
Yeah,
it was basically me trying to negotiate, like, if you come back, then I'll make it worth your while. And if you don't come back, then you might not survive this. So
right. And then did you keep your promise?
I did, yeah,
Yeah,
for the most part. I
yeah,
mean,
that's
not
the
not
important part.
yeah, not maybe not every single day, but almost every day.
Yeah. So I don't. Was there another question in
Just,
there?
I mean, obviously people communicate with their animals, you know, like through words that we're constantly talking to them, not knowing whether they
Mhm.
can understand. And I remember listening to the dog whisperer talk about this, how he said in nature with packs of dogs that they first read the energy of the other dogs, so in a sense that could be like their telepathic communication. And then they read body language kind of secondarily to that. And then least important is verbal communication.
Oh
And
yeah.
so almost like the animals are prioritizing this kind of, direct transference of thought, this energetic communication over all other types, even the nonverbal gestures and things that they would pick up on.
Right. And one thing that was interesting in my dog training days, people would always be impressed if a dog knew hand signals, right? And it was like, well, it's way easier for a dog than verbal. I mean, not that verbal's hard, but it just goes to your point of that, what you were saying about like energy first and then body language. And then, um, so yeah, but I think animals are definitely reading the energy, picking up the energy of us and other animals all the time.
So when you have a client that reaches out saying, I'm having an issue with my pet and that, having the ability to communicate would help to find a solution to whatever the issue is, like what are some examples of problems that you've encountered that you've helped solve?
I for dogs, I do a lot of fear and anxiety work and communication. So I do the communication, and I also, if in a case like that, I'll bring in the angels, and we might do some clearing and healing. But what I find in general is sometimes just allowing the animal to communicate and be heard solves the problem. And then, yeah, and then I do have the animals sometimes do have specific things that the person is having a problem with, like a cat not using the litter box, aggression, a dog that's aggressive, that that sort of thing. And sometimes we do use a bargaining thing, like you did with with the gerbil. But I also try to tell people that just because we're asking the animal to do something doesn't mean that they're going to. Like, if someone told you, even someone of, like a doctor or something, was like, you need to eat 2 pounds of broccoli a day, it's really going to help you. And say you hate broccoli, you might be like, I'm not doing that. Or you might be like, okay, they asked me to, I'm going to do it. Or they're saying I should. So just like every person is an individual, so is every animal.
So the ability to communicate doesn't guarantee that there's going to be some type of like agreement or understanding. I mean, ultimately, we're all sovereign beings and we're going to follow our will, whichever direction it leads us. But it does seem, at least, like if they're, and this is true for, nonverbal autistic children, that, you know, what what we see as certain behaviors might just be us misinterpreting what, for a lot of us are just normal feelings. Like I know in the telepathy tapes and even in other things I've read, JB Handley, I think his last name is, has a book that he wrote with his son called Underestimated, where he talks about his son who is nonverbal, and then he was able to break through this new technique that they've developed, where instead of trying to teach nonverbal children how to speak or type, which are fine motor skills, they use letterboarding, where they literally have the children point to letters on a board, because those use the gross motor functions of the arm and shoulder rather than the mouth and fingers, and which are fine motor functions. And so when he was finally able to communicate with them, he would say, like, what you would perceive as self-destructive behavior, me punching holes in the wall or banging my head against things, like, was my body misinterpreting the signals I was sending. And I was frustrated. I wasn't trying to be destructive, but there's this mind-body disconnect, which is kind of specific to, you know, these nonverbal children, nonverbal autistic children, not necessarily animals, but just that, like, what we see as maybe really aggressive behavior in a dog, like you were saying, could just be anxiety, that we're
Hmm.
misinterpreting as like the dog, is hostile towards me, or, however we're interpreting it. So at least it leads to a better degree of understanding. So even if, like, again, you're saying they're not necessarily going to agree with whatever you're trying to tell them, at least the understanding of the problem is half of the solution to it.
Right. And like I said, a lot of times just letting them talk helps. And so usually it does help one way or another, but I just like to tell people it's not like you said, right? They're sovereign, they're not robots. We're not programming them to act a certain way. Um, and to your other point of like, I mean, misreading things a bit, like my two dogs will get in little scuffles. And I know, because of my animal behavior background, I know that of course, their hormones are raised, like their cortisol, and, takes a while to come down. But when they would get in these little scuffles, I feel like I was affected more than they were, right? Like they just like said their piece, no one was hurt, and they moved on. So I was just bringing that up about like the kind of misreading things. Obviously, it's I didn't misread it. Like, right, they did get in a scuffle, but they're also like, we're fine. It's not
Yeah.
that big of a deal.
For them, there's not that continuity of emotion, where for them it's just like a burst of emotion and that, or
Right.
feeling, and then it's gone.
Yeah.
And whereas we're like, oh my God, I can't believe my dogs are fighting.
Right. And again, every dog and dogs are individual, because I've worked with dogs that, because they are so escalated after fight, and of course every fight has a different degree. The one I'm talking about, it's just a little rah rah. But some dogs do need to be separated for like 48 hours or more. So I just want to put that out there. I'm not saying like a dog getting in a fight's not a big deal. It totally
Yeah,
can be.
for sure. Yeah, there's different degrees of severity and, and maybe for certain things, the first solution might not be trying to telepathically communicate with them. It might just be like separate them and, take immediate action. And then once you're in a position to be able to, you know, take another approach, do some type of like reading and communication, then, I guess there's a time and a place for it. Might not be in the middle of a,
Right. And that's what that's how I work with clients now. Uh, it's like, let me know what's going on with you and your pet, and then we'll see. Maybe we'll do some behavior modification. Maybe we'll do some training. Maybe we'll do a communication. I mean, there's usually always some communication. Maybe we'll do a healing. So I like to approach it as what fits the situation best and bring in a few modalities.
so obviously you do a lot of different types of spiritual services and emotional services for people and animals. I mean, do you feel like these all kind of emanate from the same source, like your ability? Because I guess to give some people a little bit of background about you, as some people watching this will know who you are, but for anyone new, I mean, you've been a kind of advisor to people, spiritual advisor, life coach, for I don't know, you were saying was it about a decade now, or
Hmm.
even longer than that. And when I met you, you were just starting to do channeling for people, and you did some channelings for me that were like dead on accurate. And that's when and you actually helped me learn how to do channeling. I'm still, very much cultivating that ability in myself. And that, I think I channel in a very different way too. I think like yours is a bit more direct because you get downloads of words. Like I
Hmm.
tend to get images and then I have to interpret them, which makes it a little bit kind of nebulous. But I mean, you've been doing channeling, you've been doing healing, energetic healing, communication. Like what? I mean, for you, like where did this all come from? Is this stuff that other people can learn, these abilities? I'm curious, like how you got started and even just, like you had a career that you were successful in before you gave all that up to do this, and then like how, where did this all come from in your life?
Yeah, so I've always been open to all of this, but I was never one of those people that, like, as a child, I was getting images and stuff. Um, and I always knew that I wanted to help people. Like, I've just always known that. I also knew I always wanted my own business. I knew that from a pretty young age. Uh, but when I was trying to decide what I wanted to go to school for, I was going to go for counseling. And my guidance counselor was like, "Oh, don't do that. You won't make any money." And all my life, I heard from my parents, go to school, get a degree where you can make good money. So between hearing that and what the guidance counselor said, I was like, okay, I guess I'm not going to do counseling. And so I applied at the school I thought I was going to go to. I applied at the College of Business and ended up really liking my accounting classes. And it just came to me naturally. It was easy for me. So, long story short, that's what I ended up doing. As soon as I got my first job in accounting, I was like, oh, well, this isn't fun. And I knew it's not what I wanted to do. I still knew I was supposed to be helping people, but I didn't know how to make that transition. So fast forward probably like 15 years later, I was in and out of accounting because I would do it for like 7 years and be like, oh, I can't do this anymore. I need a break. And I would take a job at a boutique or something, just to bring some money in. But then I was like, all right, well, I need to get a quote unquote real job again. And I'd go back to accounting. And so after doing that, like I said, for probably about 15 years, maybe less, I quit my accounting job and was like, I'm not going back. And so I started meditating every day, which led to me remembering my dreams at night. And I knew there was a reason I was remembering them. And so I started writing them down. And then eventually I started looking up the symbols that were in my dream. And nothing was really resonating with what I was finding online. It just seemed like stuff people would want to hear, right? Not necessarily the truth. And then I found Michael Sheridan's website, and I had cancer symbols in my dream, and which was alarming to me because my mom had passed away from cancer. So anyway, I contacted Michael. We started working together. He started interpreting my dreams, and I started doing some therapies with him. Well, I did cutting the ties that bind, which I've done many, many times on my own as well. And he was the first one to point out all of my spiritual gifts because they're in your dreams. They're in everyone's dreams. And to answer your question, yes, most people, if I mean, everyone has spiritual gifts. So yeah.
It's interesting too because I think dreams are probably our most direct access to these kinds of telepathic abilities because they're coming from our unconscious mind, which is not so limited to, the body and the senses and everything as it seems our conscious mind is, even though that's also, I think, kind of a misunderstanding of our waking consciousness, that it has the same ability to perceive and connect to things that it doesn't have direct access to in time and space. But when I've been reading about telepathy, that's something that a lot of people who have experience in this say is like first look at your dreams. I mean, that's where you're going to find evidence of telepathy. And I know for me, in my own life, I used to be very skeptical of the idea that dreams meant anything because I didn't
Mhm.
think there was a way you could know for sure. I always thought it's possible. I was never closed off to the idea. But I always just thought, like, how do you know if it's not just your brain processing random events, from the day or from your life, and just it could just be chaos. And
Mhm.
I had a dream where I was going through a pretty difficult time. I was dealing with a breakup, and in the dream, I went with my family to visit the house we lived in when I was a child in Ohio. And when we got there, the house was completely overgrown. There was foliage covering most of the house. There was a foot of water in the backyard and, grass up to my knees. It looked like a place that had been neglected, like it hadn't been attended to. And we walked through the house and it was completely empty. And then I came outside and I collapsed on the sidewalk and started crying. And my mom was standing behind me and she was like, "Are you crying because of, this person that I had just gone through the breakup with?" And I said, "No, if I'd never left the house, then I feel like my life would have turned out okay." And then I woke up and even just the content of that dream, I think was like giving me guidance on how to address what I was like dealing with that time emotionally, which was don't look at what is in your immediate experience. It's not the loss of this relationship that's upsetting you. It's unresolved issues you have from your childhood. And that was like the beginning of my healing process, which was like a major life event for me. But it was interesting, the telepathic aspect of it was I looked up the house a few years later on Google Maps and it was completely covered in foliage, just like in the dream. I have a
Mm.
picture of it I actually saved too. And so I thought, well, that was even stranger. Not only was that the first time I felt like a dream was my subconscious was communicating with me directly, but there was also this aspect of it where, like, how did I know that this house had been neglected in the same way that, it was portrayed in the dreams? So I do think there's truth to that. Like dreams are a really great starting point for people to look at, where they're able to perceive things, where they're getting messages from either their unconscious or higher self or from, other beings like you're talking about. You connect with the angelic realm. I think
Mhm.
that's an interesting starting point that everyone has access to.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe our dreams are, yes, I mean, they can definitely be just stuff that happened during the day in our brain processing it, and messages from our subconscious, but most importantly, also messages from our higher self and our guides. Um, yeah, I love dreams and I love dream work, and following my dreams definitely helped me on my healing and spiritual path.
For sure. Yeah, I find it more interesting, even just certain things that happen in life. Like I feel dream interpretation also helps me interpret things that I think are channeled messages, like downloads, and also just things in my life. Like, there, I had a really irrational fear of this coat closet in our house as a kid because I always thought in the sort of shadowy part underneath where the coats were that there was this hole that opened up into kind of an underground cave where if I got into the closet, I could fall into the hole and then I wouldn't be able to get out. And I started reading Carl Jung's memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and he talked about how the house is a symbol of the conscious mind and the subterranean realm is a symbol of the unconscious mind. And the fact that like at this really young age, like maybe like 5, I had this really kind of archetypal experience of a fear that's like very much like the meaning of it is very much in line with like, these kinds of like universal symbols. But like I had no idea where that came from. It was just the closet, which is kind of like the secrets that we keep. And then that being the passageway towards the unconscious. It was just this fear of like, what is down there. And I think as a child, most of what we're afraid of is, comprised of things that are kind of the unconscious, like kind of our fears that are, personified in monsters and, all kinds of imagery. And so I just thought that was interesting too. I feel like the interpretation of dreams also helped me better understand maybe some things that were kind of apparent early on in life that I needed to, again, address. Like the dream was telling me, look at things that are, that you've been unconscious of. So
Yeah.
I do think dream interpretation is very helpful on a lot of different levels.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And that's why that one dream was at your childhood home, right? Anytime we have a dream at our childhood home, it's like there's stuff from back then that needs to be healed.
For
So,
sure. And do you find that, just people owning pets, what is the healing benefit of that? I think a lot of people know that, like, for people dealing with depression, having a pet can be really helpful for that. There's like obvious things, you just know that like being in the presence of an animal seems to uplift people. But do you feel like is there more to that than we realize, other than just we enjoy being around animals because they're more present and, dogs just they want to be your friend. They love you unconditionally. They're kind of what we would hope to find in any kind of relationship, just kind of like selfless and loving.
yeah. And I think it's interesting that we have chosen our pets and they've chosen us, like just like we've chosen our family, right? Before we actually incarnated here. And usually there's a lesson that we're supposed to learn with our pets. And I think you mentioned like just that unconditional love. So even sometimes I think that is the reason why we have dogs in our lives, right? To show us that unconditional love and try to open our hearts even more.
Sure. Yeah, you know, it, I feel like there's a whole lot of topics that we're eventually gonna have to get into because,
Mhm.
even just talking about animals, I mean, when you're talking about your pre-life plan, I hear that a lot, and especially with people who have near-death experiences, and that was something I spent a great deal of time reading about. And when I say I do research, I don't do this really professionally. I give presentations for a spiritual group, and I've covered a handful of different topics, some of which I think we're going to discuss as we do, subsequent episodes. But the topic of near-death experiences is interesting because of the fact that, there's a similarity in these experiences people have where they see um, that, their life was meant to teach them some type of lesson and that they agreed to it before they were born and that and that their consciousness existed prior to being born and will continue on after death. Um, but that, just the fact that, people are having these really vivid experiences and a lot of people describe them as being even more real than their waking life. These are all happening when there's zero brain activity. And it'd be one thing if, these were just experiences that really had no basis in reality. You could say, well, maybe they had that false memory after they regained consciousness. But what seems to have a lot of researchers mystified about this is the fact that a lot of these people can remember things that happened while they were unconscious, while there was zero brain activity. And there's been examples of surgeries and things. There was a woman, I think her name was Pam Reynolds, who had an aneurysm and that they had to operate on by cooling her body to 60 degrees, draining all of the blood from her head. And then she was basically in this state of, just like zero brain activity, zero, like heart rate for something like 2 hours. And she could recall the conversations that were had between the surgeon and his assistants. She could recall the music that was playing. She was a trained musician. She described a lot of, there's a lot to her experience, but just one of the most interesting parts were those aspects that could be verified objectively. And so when people have these experiences and they not only can report, seeing things that, that happened during the time that they're supposedly unconscious, but that there's these other aspects of it where they have a kind of life review where they see whether or not they're, being a loving person. And that's supposedly the message that a lot of these people take away is that, the purpose of life is ultimately to learn to become a more loving person and to learn things. It's what you've
Hmm.
learned and how loving a person you are. Those are kind of what we're here for. It's what we're meant to explore in this life. But a lot of this is agreed to prior to our being born. So the fact that our animals appear to play some part in that is interesting. I've heard people talk about the fact that your animals follow you through different lifetimes as well.
Yeah.
And, I don't know what to make of all of it. I'm certainly open to it. Again, it's kind of like the dream thing where I can't really prove it one way or the other, but sometimes you just have such a strong sense of like, well, I've had some experience that like definitely makes me lean very heavily towards thinking that there's some truth to that. And I think with the NDEs, there's so much evidence for it now that I almost feel like the burden of proof is shifted for people to disprove it than to prove that it's true.
Right. And why does it have to be proven?
I think like whether or not because I guess whether or not you take it seriously, I guess, but maybe it's just, if you're talking about our pre-life plan, maybe it's not really that important whether or not you know that to be true. You
Well,
don't really,
I think that's the difference between like me and you. Like I just kind of know it and you're like, well, show me the proof, which is fine, right? And there's a lot of people like you and then there's a lot of people like me too. So it's just a difference. So I was just yeah, I was just kind of playing with you, but I was like, well, why does it have to be proven? Can it just be or not be? Like, right?
yeah, it's almost like a masculine and feminine thing too. I was told that that's one of the things I'm meant to learn in this life by a channeler was to cultivate more of the feminine aspect of myself, the feeling of truth, not the logical
Hmm.
rationalizing of everything. I don't
Yeah.
think I'm a particularly rational person. I do think that there's a balance, maybe more than some people, but I do think that I tend to approach even spiritual things from a scientific
Hmm.
um, kind of point of view where I'm like I'm trying to as best I can to like make a case for why things are valid. Whereas
Yeah.
it'd be easy just to say like law of attraction, for example, if it's just working for you, like who cares if you can prove it or not? I mean, you're really just experimenting, and if you're seeing results, I mean, maybe you're just putting it together that way in your mind. But for me, I always want to try to, explain things and explore things in a way that, I could say, like, it's not so easy to dismiss these things, like the NDE phenomena. Really
Yeah.
difficult to dismiss because of the out of body element of it.
Right. Yeah. No, and I think that's great.
But
And
yeah,
I wanted just to touch on the masculine and feminine because when you're talking about like why we're here, that's one of the things a lot of us, if not, I think pretty much everyone, um, is here to work on balancing either masculine or feminine. And so, yeah, so it's interesting that you even said that you were told that by a channel. So that makes a lot of sense.
which I think is true for sure. And honestly, when I think part of, cultivating more of a sense of feeling and intuition, I do think that having a non-human being, because I have a daughter, and so obviously I nurture her and, we have a very loving relationship, but, we communicate directly. Maybe when she was a baby, it was a little bit different, when she's a purely emotional creature, you certainly can't reason with her, you kind
Mhm.
of, I always joke that it was kind of like having a plant that just like screams at you and
That's
is constantly
great.
going to the bathroom. But with animals, I feel like it sort of forces you to have more of a feeling-based approach to your relationship because, you can't rely on, you know, I mean, to some extent at least, like verbal communication is not going to be enough. And with my daughter's cat, I was at her mom's house and I sort of was walking and she kind of caught me, like, got in between my legs. And so I sort of like uh almost like tripped over her or whatever, and she looked at me for a second like she was like I had intentionally done it, and then I was
Right.
like quickly like, oh, I'm so sorry, and she could tell I felt bad about it. And I think just that feeling, like I saw just the change in the way she was looking at me. So I think
Yeah.
that it's just like I wanted to know like I felt bad about it, not that she was like seriously hurt or anything, but she just was more startled than anything. But I think
Yeah.
with her I was just like I really wanted to convey the feeling that I had because I knew I couldn't do it just with words. And so I think that that's how you communicate with animals.
Yeah. Yeah. And I totally know that look that you're talking about. Like they look at
Yeah.
you like you did it on purpose. Sorry.
Why would you do that to me?
Yeah.
I remember my cat was sleeping next to me, in my cat that I had for like 23 years. She was sleeping next to me and my alarm went off. And instead of grabbing the alarm, I accidentally grabbed her and she just gave me this look like, what is wrong with you? Why are you doing this?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I find the whole topic really fascinating. Like I said, I mean, I've been reading a lot of Rupert Sheldrake's books since I, started down this rabbit hole, and and he talks about how, like, for him, there's this whole kind of larger theory that there's this kind of field that exists where it's like it's almost like there's like a kind, like when we're talking about telepathy, obviously it's not just necessarily, or I should say extrasensory perception is not necessarily just telepathy and the ability to communicate, but it's also to being able to perceive things that, are happening at a distance that you couldn't perceive, with your senses, or happening in another place in time in the past or in the future, like premonition and things like that. But I think that, he his research into this kind of suggests that like our model of consciousness is wrong. That this idea that our consciousness, whether it's in humans or in animals, that this is an epiphenomenon of brain activity that gives rise to consciousness is not accurate. That in a sense, consciousness is just a field, like in the same way, a similar way at least, maybe not like quite as physical, but like an electromagnetic field or gravitational field. That it's a kind of field where information is stored. I know people in the like Theosophical Society talked about the Akashic records, and Carl Jung's talked about the collective unconscious, that there's like this place where all of this information is stored. And so when you're channeling, do you feel like you're tapping into a kind of like universal um, archive of knowledge, or is it more like you're connecting with beings and it's like a direct kind of communication?
Yeah, pretty much all the work I do, like I said, I have a team of angels that I connect with and receive information from them. So that's how I perceive it, unless I'm communicating with an animal. And sometimes I channel too with my team when I'm communicating with an animal, but when it's just direct communication with the animal, then that's obviously just me and them. But yeah, overall channeling is with angels, and it's not always just my angels. Sometimes it's with the person's higher self. Of course, I communicate with my higher self.
And when you say angels, I mean, obviously people have a picture in their mind of winged beings, kind of biblical beings. Is that accurate, or would you describe it differently?
When I see them, it's like I mean, there's form, but it's mostly just bright. Like it's like I see them as a light being. But I mean, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does actually, and it's interesting because when people have near-death experiences, they describe a lot of the beings that they encounter as beings of light or a being of light, which, they a lot of times they'll talk about it as if it were God. Maybe it's some aspect of God. If, we're talking about kind of the infinite, the kind of higher consciousness of existence or creation or however you want to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, light is something that and we chose that as part of the name for this podcast, obviously, because I think part of this, what I would describe as an awakening, maybe you'd agree with that, is that things like the abilities that you're describing that, you're able to use to help heal animals and heal people are something that people are becoming more aware of. I think we're awakening to who we really are. I think that's part of this whole ascension that we're going through. And so we chose the name Rising Light because I think it's sort of bringing things that were previously unconscious to us into our waking consciousness. And I think that, that just this idea that, maybe our understanding of consciousness as being separate, like my consciousness is separate from yours because it's tied to my body, which is kind of a symbol of separation. We each have our own individual bodies, that maybe that's a misperception of reality, that certainly on the level of form, it appears that we're separate, but on a deeper level, maybe the absolute level, that, we're all interconnected, and that's what allows for the ability to communicate with animals and other spiritual gifts like channeling. So I think that it's an interesting time because, maybe previously, although I do think maybe there were times in history where people were more open to these gifts, and then other times where, especially in the last few hundred years, really since the Enlightenment, I think there's been more of a focus on the material plane. But yeah, it does seem like a lot of that's changing now.
Yeah, I agree. When I first got into this work, I said, you know how like back in the day, like yoga was weird to people
Oh
and
yeah.
um but now there's a yoga studio on like every corner. And I was like, soon it's going to be like, people are going to be like, oh, I was talking to my energy healer. It's just going to be like a normal conversation or, like I got this channeled information and it's going to definitely be more widespread. And I also wanted to comment on the connection thing. Yeah, I totally believe, right? We're all one. We're all connected for sure. But I never thought of it in the sense of like, oh, that makes it, I don't know if you said easier, but possible maybe to communicate like telepathically. And of course, people have the ability to communicate telepathically with each other too. So there's also that.
We'll have to do another episode on telepathy and other forms of ESP. But one of the things I'll mention is that when, these autistic children who were previously nonverbal, but then are able to communicate through letterboarding, and some of them do gain the ability to speak and type. So even just being able to exercise those gross motor function skills will sometimes enable them to heal whatever was preventing them from being able to use their fine motor skills. What's interesting is that, well, two things that I found most fascinating reading about them, both in J.B. Handley's book and then listening to the accounts of autistic nonverbal children and the telepathy tapes, is that one, they view us as the ones with the limitation, the fact that we have to use speech to communicate, whereas
Mm-hmm.
they talk about a place that they are all able to sort of tune into. It's not really a place, but it's a kind of frequency. They call it the hill. They go there to communicate with each other and support each other. Some of them are autistic children whose parents do know that they're cognitively intact, and they've been able to use things like spelling to communicate to um, be able to, kind of, not be presumed to be incompetent. And other children whose parents don't know, and they're in a sense kind of trapped in their body. And so the second thing I thought was most interesting is that because of this mind-body disconnect in severe autism, like full symptom autism, a lot of these autistic children don't even know that they have a body, which I thought was really interesting. So they can't communicate with it, and when they do try, when they have the feeling of anger again, like sometimes it comes out as them like punching themselves, and that's not, they'll say that's not what I'm intending to do. It's my body misinterpreting the signals of my brain. The intention there is being distorted. And so there's an interesting aspect of the mind that, when it is kind of completely or at least partially severed from the body in the same way like a radio that's kind of broken, doesn't the signal doesn't come through clearly. You just get a lot of static. That's kind of what they're experiencing, but that signal is out there. That's the main thing, is that this like aspect of their minds that is cognitively intact. And what's again interesting about them is also that they seem to exhibit a higher degree of intelligence and compassion than most children at that age. And despite the fact that most of them have never had any formal education, I know that JB Hanley's son, basically his education consisted of like kindergarten for, 12 years. So it wasn't until they were able to break through the communication barrier that they even realized that there was a highly intelligent person in there. So I do think it's funny how they sort of view us as the speakers are the ones that are limited by, their need to verbalize everything. We have to
Mhm.
worry about how things are conveyed and how people are going to interpret it. For them, it's all understood.
And is in what you read, is there anything like, do they talk about the like spirit world or whatever
Oh yeah.
you want to call it? Because I mean, that's how it is in the spirit world, right? Like we're not talking; it's all telepathic. And I feel like they are close to that, like they are close to the spirit world.
Yeah, they can communicate with people who've passed on, so they can relay messages from deceased family members to people who are alive. And they can see, like some of them talk about beings that would be very similar to like what you're describing, like the angelic realm. They can communicate with spirit. They have experiences that are very much sort of similar to near-death experiences, just in terms of like kind of experiencing that kind of a point of view of like, well, why did I come into this life? That kind of thing, like sort of the bigger picture of like why they're having this physical experience. And some of them are able to communicate. Some of them, pass away. Like one child in the telepathy tapes died by drowning, but then he communicated with his mother through a dream that like that was all planned out ahead of time, and that he's fine. He didn't experience any pain during his death and that sort of thing, which again kind of goes back to what we're talking about, like whether or not, dreams are really giving us authentic messages. But I mean, it certainly for the mom, like that was something that like helped comfort her during that. In the same way, NDEs, I think, even when we read about them, they have a comforting effect on people that helps alleviate that fear of death that, we seem to want to ignore in most of our lives. But yeah, that's the most interesting part about it, is the fact that there is this like strong spiritual element to this whole story about them that is similar to the way, we're talking about how people and animals communicate with each other telepathically.
Yeah, and I wanted to say about animals in the spirit world. Some people might find it interesting that a lot of their animals, after they pass on, have jobs and things to do up there. So that's always fun too. When I talk to past animals, finding out finding out what they're doing up there, and their people enjoy hearing that as well.
Well,
Um,
to tie
Go
these
ahead.
two things together, my mom had a near-death experience. She actually had several. I knew about one that's kind of a classic near-death experience with, out-of-body experience. And but then she had a couple that they would be grouped in with near-death experiences or more like visionary encounters, like when you see beings surrounding you at the,
Mhm.
as you're approaching death, like in the hospital. But she passed away in 2010. And my brother-in-law had a dream about her afterwards, where she came to tell him that like she had now taken on the task of helping animals transition from death. So she was helping, especially like injured animals and things like that. That was the task that she most enjoyed now that she was kind of in the next phase
Yeah.
of her, life, and so I thought that was interesting, and it's something I could totally see her doing. And
Yeah.
so I don't know. I mean, like I said, my view on dreams has changed completely, and I'll save some of this for future episodes, but we should do one on dreams. And I've had
Yeah.
some very uncanny experiences that have emanated from things that I had happened during dreams and then spilled over into my waking life. So
Yeah. No, yeah, we definitely should. Yeah, that's really cool about your mom. And I wanted to mention too, since we're talking about animal communication, um, a lot of times people will come to me for an animal communication reading when their pet is near, ready to transition. And it can be really helpful for the pet because sometimes they're fine, like they're okay, they're ready. But sometimes they do have questions and sometimes they do have a little fear. You wouldn't really think that they would because, they're not in their heads as much as we are. But so yeah, it can be really helpful for them to be able to communicate and talk to their person before they transition.
for sure. Well, speaking of transitioning, any closing thoughts? As obviously these are services you provide people. So if anyone wanted to contact you, what would be the best way for them to reach you? Just kind of wanted to give you the chance to
Uh,
close this out.
yeah, my website is melissabr.com. So that's Melissa, B as in Brian, R as in Robert.com. And I also wanted to let people know that in about 2 months, I'm teaching a animal communication course. It's going to be about 8 weeks long, and yeah, by I don't know the second or third session, you'll be communicating with animals.
Very cool. Well, thank you for taking the time to chat about this. I look forward to future discussions. I think we're going to cover a lot of interesting topics. All feel very relevant for these times. So thank
Yeah,
you again.
yeah. Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, and we look forward to presenting you with more interesting discussions here in the coming months. Thank you.